I froze mid-step as the church candle flame trembled, realizing my wife had chosen the pew beside another man, not me. Still, I sat behind them, fingers tightening on the wood as the flame flickered, and I held my marriage together in silence. As the hymn swelled, the flame's heat seemed louder, matching the closeness she shared with him. While I watched that same flame waver, I understood love doesn't leave loudly. It just stops turning back. The same, unblinking flame showed me I'd been a husband in title, not in her heart. That's when I decided to let the flame burn steady, without her, choosing dignity over devotion. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. David Bishop parked at the curb under the church's white-lit portico and sat for a beat with both hands still on the steering wheel. Snow had been falling since mid-afternoon, soft enough to look harmless, heavy enough to hush the town. Through the windshield, the old stone church glowed like a postcard, wreaths on the doors, candlelight in the tall windows, people moving inside as if the whole building had a pulse. Eliza was already reaching for the door handle before he'd even killed the engine. "You coming?" she asked, voice light practiced. David stepped out into the cold and followed her up the steps. He'd worn the coat she liked, the one that made him look like he belonged in photographs. She didn't link her arm through his like she used to. She walked half a step ahead, heels clicking on the wet stone as if she were late to something important. Inside, warmth hit him first, radiators, bodies, the smell of pine garland and old hymnals. Somewhere near the front, a children's choir was tuning up, thin voices rising and falling. The sanctuary was full in that particular small-town way. Familiar faces, careful smiles, long memory. People nodded at David, some of them with that deferential warmth that always made him feel slightly miscast, like he'd been given a role he hadn't auditioned for. Eliza moved through the aisle without looking back. David slowed when he realized she wasn't heading toward their usual pew. She slipped into a row closer to the front, beside Matthew West. Matthew turned as she sat, his expression easy, like he'd been saving that spot. He leaned in to say something that made Eliza's mouth lift into a smile that didn't reach her eyes when she was with David anymore. When David stepped into the row behind them, Eliza twisted at the waist and looked up at him as if she just noticed he existed. "Oh, hi," she said. The word was neat and polite, like a stranger greeting another stranger at the grocery store. "I thought you'd sit back there." David stared at her for a moment, waiting for the softening, some hint of embarrassment, some silent acknowledgement that this was odd. It didn't come. She faced forward again, shoulders angled subtly toward Matthew, not him. David slid into the pew behind them, knees stiff, and let the hymn book rest untouched in his lap. The choir began their first song, bright and clean, and the congregation rose. David stood with everyone else, but it felt like his body had gotten the timing wrong. His eyes kept snagging on the line of Eliza's neck, on the way she tilted her head toward Matthew when he whispered. Once or twice she laughed under her breath. David couldn't hear what was said, only the intimacy of it. From the pulpit, Deacon Samuel Green stepped forward in his dark suit, hands folded like he'd been carved into that posture over decades. He scanned the pews, smiling at the familiar, then his gaze landed on David. "And we're blessed tonight," the deacon said, voice carrying, "to have with us David Bishop, one of the great landowners of this county, a steward of God's bounty." Heads turned, smiles bloomed. A few people nodded like they'd just been reminded of something important. David felt heat crawl up his collar. Landowner, steward, titles that fit neatly on paper and never once made a marriage feel warmer. He forced a polite nod because that was what you did when an entire town decided your value out loud. He looked at Eliza, expecting her to glance back, to share a look, anything. She didn't. She was watching Matthew, her face softened in a way David hadn't seen aimed at him in months. A tightness settled behind David's ribs. He told himself it was nothing. Church was crowded. People sat where they could. Eliza was just being friendly. Matthew was just nearby. Still, when the choir's voices swelled and the candles flickered along the aisle, David couldn't stop watching the space between Eliza and Matthew. How small it was, how effortlessly it stayed that way. And he realized he'd been holding his breath for most of the first hymn. The hymn ended and everyone sat, the movement of bodies and winter coats sounding like a slow wave rolling through the sanctuary. David eased back onto the hard wood and tried to focus on the front, on the candlelight, on the carved beams overhead, on the steady rhythm of a service he'd attended his whole life. But his eyes kept drifting to the pew in front of him, to Eliza's profile and the dark line of Matthew West's shoulder beside her. Hit him in small, sharp pieces. This wasn't new, not the feeling anyway. The last year of his marriage had been a gradual evacuation. Conversations trimmed down to logistics. Touch reduced to accidental contact in doorways. Eliza still laughed at jokes in public, still played the gracious wife at dinners, but at home she moved through rooms like David was furniture, useful, permanent, easy to ignore. He detold himself it was stress, holiday pressure, work. He'd let silence become normal B. Cause confronting it felt like ripping up a floorboard to see what was rotting underneath. Up front, the choir's second song began, softer now. Eliza didn't sing. She leaned slightly toward Matthew, her shoulders angling the way they used to angle toward David when they were dating, when she wanted him to feel like the only person in the room. Matthew murmured something, and Eliza's lips pressed into a private smile. Not big, not showy. Familiar. Intimate. David's throat tightened with a hot kind of disbelief. He leaned forward a few inches and whispered, low enough that only she would hear. "Eliza." She turned just enough to show him the edge of her face. Her eyes flicked to him, then away, like a courtesy glance. "We're in church," she murmured, flat and controlled, then faced forward again. David swallowed. He tried again a little later when the congregation stood for a responsive reading. He reached out not to touch her, just to get her attention, his hand hovering near the back of her coat. "Eliza, can we?" "David," her voice sharpened on his name without rising in volume. "Not now." Around them, people shifted. Someone in the pew to David's left, Mrs. Harlan, perfume and pearls, leaned over with a bright smile. "David Bishop, isn't it?" she said as if they weren't in the middle of a prayer. "We're so grateful you donated those acres for the new youth center. My grandson is just thrilled." David forced his face into something polite. "Of course," he said, because that was the only acceptable answer in this town. "Happy to help." She kept talking, the way people did when they felt entitled to your attention. Another man leaned in from the aisle, offering a firm handshake and a quick comment about property taxes and how lucky the county was to have responsible owners. It was a strange kind of attention, warm, congratulatory, and completely indifferent to what was happening 2 feet in front of him. David nodded, responded, played his part. Each interruption pushed him farther back from Eliza, like an invisible hand was widening the gap. Matthew turned halfway in his seat as if to look past Eliza. His eyes met David's for the first time that night. The expression on his face wasn't overtly hostile. It was worse than that, confident, amused, like he was watching someone struggle with a puzzle he already knew the answer to. His mouth curved into a small smile and held there just long enough to land. David felt his stomach drop. He looked away quickly, pretending to adjust his cuffs, pretending the heat in his face was from the church's radiators. The service continued, but David stopped absorbing it. He watched Eliza's hands instead, how they rested in her lap, how they shifted when Matthew leaned close, how she didn't once glance back to see if David was still there. More than once he caught himself thinking, this is what it looks like when a person is done. Not angry, not dramatic, just absent. Deacon Green stepped up for the sermon, and the congregation settled into attentive silence. The deacon's voice filled the sanctuary with that steady, practiced warmth that made people feel safe. "Tonight," he said, "we remember what holds a community together: tradition, family, The quiet work of showing up for one another year after year, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. David listened and the words landed like weight. Tradition, family, showing up. He'd shown up. He'd provided. He'd paid for renovations, funded scholarships, kept the land in the family when selling it would have been easier. He'd done what men like him were raised to do: protect the name, protect the legacy, keep the wheels turning. And yet, sitting behind his wife while she shared her attention with another man, David felt like a guest in his own life. Not the center, not even a partner, just someone occupying space. The deacon spoke about forgiveness and patience, about the strength it took to mend what was strained. David's mind kept snagging on a single question he didn't want to ask. What if there's nothing left to mend? He stared at the back of Eliza's head and tried to remember the last time she'd looked at him the way she was looking at Matthew now, unguarded, engaged, present. He couldn't find it. That absence left a hollow pressure in his chest, the kind that didn't announce itself as pain until you stopped moving. When the congregation rose again, David stood with them, hands at his sides, jaw tight. He told himself he would talk to her after the benediction. He would find the right words, the calm ones, the ones that didn't sound desperate. He would ask what was going on and demand an honest answer. But as the choir began the next hymn, Eliza leaned closer to Matthew, and Matthew, without turning fully, let that same knowing smile flicker again, like he was daring David to try. The final hymn faded into the rafters, and the congregation spilled out in slow, cheerful clusters, cheeks pink from warmth and wine-colored scarves. David moved with the crowd as if he were part of it, but his attention stayed fixed on the pew ahead, on Eliza and Matthew standing close enough that their coats brushed when they turned. In the aisle, Eliza laughed at something Matthew said, her hand landing briefly on his forearm as if it belonged there. It wasn't overt. It was worse, natural. The kind of contact people didn't think about because it didn't feel risky to them. David watched, jaw set, the muscles in his neck tightening with every small exchange he couldn't hear. Down the hall, the church social had already begun. The fellowship room smelled like coffee, sugar, and the sharp bite of pine from the centerpiece branches. Someone had laid out trays of cookies and a crock-pot of cider. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter bouncing off the painted cinderblock walls. It should have been comforting. It should have felt like home. David took a paper cup from the table and let his hands do something normal while his mind ran hot. He tried to mingle, nodded at faces, returned holiday wishes, answered the same questions about the land and the weather and the new fence line. People spoke to him the way they spoke to a public figure, friendly, grateful, slightly careful. No one asked if he was okay. No one looked closely enough to see the strain. Across the room, Eliza moved like she owned the air around her. Matthew stayed at her side, and she kept making introductions, her voice bright and social. "This is Matthew West," she said to the Thompsons, to the Harpers, to a couple from the next town over. "He's been such a help." A help with what, David wondered? With the church? With the holiday fundraiser? Or with whatever had been growing between them while David was busy being useful? He drifted closer, not to eavesdrop, just to be present, to remind the room and his wife that he existed. Eliza's eyes flicked over him once, then she turned back to Matthew without missing a beat, continuing the conversation as if David were a coat rack. Matthew noticed. He always noticed. When he lifted his cup in a casual toast toward David, the gesture looked polite from a distance. Up close, the smile behind it carried a quiet dare. David felt something hard settle in his chest. He'd spent years swallowing small humiliations, missed anniversaries, half-listened conversations. The way Eliza's affection had turned into a careful performance in public and a cold vacancy at home. He told himself that providing was love, that stability was love, that a house and land and security counted for something. Standing there while his wife showcased another man like a prized guest, David realized how tired he was of being the background. Deacon Green appeared at his side with a hand on David's shoulder, warm and familiar. "You're handling tonight with grace," the deacon said, voice low. "It says a lot about a man." Grace, the word hit like a polished stone, smooth, heavy, impossible to grip. David forced a thin smile, but his eyes stayed on Eliza. The deacon's comment didn't bridge anything. It only underlined the distance everyone could sense and no one would name. When Eliza finally moved toward the coat closet, David followed, slipping into the narrow hallway beside the sanctuary where the noise dulled. He caught her just as she reached for her scarf. "Eliza," he said, keeping his voice steady, "what is going on with you and him?" She didn't even look surprised. She exhaled slow, like he'd asked her to carry something inconvenient. "David, not here." "Then where?" His control thinned at the edges. "Because you're acting like I'm." "Like you're what?" She turned, eyes sharp, impatience breaking through the charm she'd worn all evening. "You're making a scene in your own head." "I watched you," he said, quieter now because the quiet felt more dangerous. "All night." Eliza's mouth tightened. "I'm trying to enjoy Christmas service without you interrogating me." The words weren't a denial. They weren't reassurance. They were dismissal, clean, practiced, final. She stepped past him toward the fellowship room, and David stood in the hallway for a beat, listening to the muffled laughter beyond the door, feeling the space where his marriage used to be. Then he heard Matthew's voice inside, close, familiar, and Eliza's answering laugh, and something in David told him the conversation he wanted wasn't going to stay optional for much longer. David followed Eliza out of the fellowship room and into the side corridor that ran along the sanctuary wall, where the air was cooler and the noise turned into a distant blur. The hallway was lined with framed photos of past church councils and Christmas pageants, rows of smiling faces that looked like they'd never had to swallow a single ugly truth. "Eliza," he said again, firmer this time, "don't walk away from me." She stopped near a bulletin board crowded with prayer requests and potluck sign-up sheets. She didn't turn right away. When she did, her expression wasn't guilty or nervous. It was tired, impatient, like she'd been waiting for him to finally catch up. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "The truth," David said. His throat felt tight, but he kept his voice level. "About you and Matthew." Eliza's eyes didn't flinch. That was what hit hardest, how little effort it cost her to hold his gaze. "The truth is," she said, "you're acting like this is a surprise. Our marriage has been over for years, David." He stared at her, the words landing like a blunt object. "Over," he repeated, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. "Yes," she said, too calm. "I just didn't have the courage to say it. I didn't want the mess. The town, your family, the way you wrap everything in responsibility until no one can breathe." David's hands flexed at his sides. "So you decided to humiliate me instead." Eliza's mouth tightened. "This isn't about humiliating you. It's about me finally choosing something that feels alive." "And Matthew is that." David's voice sharpened despite his effort. "How long has this been going on?" Her pause was short, but it existed. "Months," she admitted. "Emotionally, longer than that, if I'm honest." The corridor seemed to narrow, the walls closing in with the weight of it. David's mind tried to find an explanation that didn't split his life in two. He'd been here in the same house, sitting across from her at the same table, and she'd been somewhere else. "So that's why," he said, the bitterness rising before he could stop it. "That's why tonight you sat with him." Eliza's eyes flicked with a quick, cold irritation. "Tonight," she said. "David, you drove me here. That's what you've been for a long time, my ride. The man who pays for things and shows up when it's expected." The sentence stripped the air from his lungs. For a moment he couldn't speak. His name, his title, his land, none of it mattered in that hallway. He was just a man hearing his wife describe him like a service. A shadow moved at the corner of David's vision. Matthew appeared from the fellowship room, cup in hand, posture relaxed like he had every right to be there. He looked from Eliza to David, then back again, and his voice came out smooth. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Matthew said. "Eliza and I, we love each other." David's jaw clenched so hard it ached. "You love her," he said low, "so you do this in a church hallway on Christmas Eve." Matthew's expression didn't change. "I'm not here for your approval," he said. "And honestly, your money, your land, it doesn't mean what you think it means." That was the moment David felt it. The sick drop of realizing the town's admiration was a costume he wore, not armor. Landowner didn't protect him from being replaced. It didn't stop another man from stepping into his marriage like it was already open ground. "Eliza," David said, voice rough now, "is this what you want him?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." Footsteps approached fast, then stopped. Deacon Green stood at the end of the hall, face tight with concern, eyes flicking between the three of them like he was trying to calculate the least damaging outcome. Now, the deacon said softly, forcing a smile that didn't belong. Let's not do this here, it's Christmas." David didn't answer. He couldn't. He just looked at Eliza, really looked, searching for a crack of regret, a tremor of humanity. She gave him nothing. And as the deacon's hand hovered uncertainly near David's shoulder, David realized the next words he spoke could burn his life down, or finally start saving it. David slipped away from the hallway before the deacon could say anything else, his legs carrying him on instinct more than intention. He found an empty pew near the back of the sanctuary, one of the shadowed corners where the candles didn't quite reach. The church had begun to quiet as families filtered out, but the space still hummed faintly with leftover warmth and the echo of voices. David sat down heavily and let his hands rest on his knees, staring at the worn wood in front of him like it might give him an answer. "My ride." The words looped in his head, dull and relentless. Not husband, not partner, a function, a convenience. He felt foolish for how long he'd believed the story he told himself. That consistency was love, that providing was intimacy, that silence meant peace. He replayed years in his mind, searching for proof that what they'd had was ever real. Anniversaries where Eliza smiled politely but pulled away from his touch. Conversations where she nodded but never engaged. Nights when she went to bed early or stayed up late, always just out of sync with him. He'd called it maturity, stability. Now it felt like a long rehearsal for abandonment. David's jaw tightened as guilt crept in, uninvited. He blamed himself with the precision of a man used to managing outcomes. He should have asked harder questions. He should have noticed sooner when she stopped confiding in him, when her laughter became something she saved for other rooms. He had been proud of not needing much, proud of being low maintenance. Somewhere along the line, that pride had taught Eliza she could live without him emotionally long before she ever left him physically. A presence settled beside him. Deacon Green lowered himself into the pew with a careful sigh, hands folded like he was about to pray. "I'm sorry," the deacon said quietly. "I didn't realize things were this strained." David nodded once, not trusting his voice. The deacon spoke about patience, about seasons of marriage, about how people sometimes lost their way and needed gentle guidance back. He talked about counseling, about forgiveness, about how public moments could distort private truths. His tone was kind, earnest, useless. David stared straight ahead as the words washed over him. None of them addressed the cold clarity of what Eliza had said. You don't come back from being reduced to a role. You don't counsel your way out of being replaced. "I appreciate it," David finally said, because politeness was a reflex he hadn't learned how to turn off. "I just need time." The deacon squeezed his shoulder once and stood, his footsteps fading down the aisle. David stayed where he was, the sanctuary now mostly empty, the Christmas decorations suddenly looking staged and fragile, like props from a play that had ended badly. From the open doors near the fellowship room he could hear laughter, Eliza's laughter, unmistakable even now. He didn't need to look to know she was with Matthew. He could picture it too easily. Her body angled toward him, her voice lighter, the way she'd already erased David from the frame. The realization burned, not because she was doing it, but because she wasn't even trying not to. Something in David shifted then, slow and heavy. The humiliation was still there, the grief pressing against his ribs, but beneath it, a colder understanding took shape. Love that had to be begged for wasn't love. Respect that depended on property and reputation wasn't respect. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he opened his contacts and scrolled until he found the number he'd hoped never to need. His lawyer. The man who handled contracts, easements, inheritance disputes. The man who knew exactly how much of David's life existed on paper. David didn't call yet. He wasn't ready for words. But the decision itself steadied him, like placing a foot on solid ground after sliding on ice. Whatever came next would be deliberate. He finally stood and turned toward the fellowship room. Through the doorway, he caught a glimpse of Eliza at a high table, Matthew close at her side, their heads bent together like they shared a private language. She didn't look up. She didn't notice David at all. For the first time that night, the town's warmth, the titles, the land, all felt weightless, and David understood how little they protected him, and how much he stood to lose if he kept pretending they ever did. The days after Christmas blurred together for David, each one carrying the same dull weight. Eliza didn't bother pretending anymore. She moved through the house with her phone in hand, smiling at messages that weren't for him, stepping outside to take calls she never explained. When Matthew came up in conversation, his name slipping into her sentences like it belonged there, David felt something inside him tighten and fray. He watched the ease between them harden into something undeniable, and every glance they shared landed like a quiet insult he was expected to ignore. At night, sleep came in pieces. David lay awake replaying moments he couldn't unsee. Eliza leaning toward Matthew at church, her laughter carried just for him, the way she hadn't once tried to soften the blow. Grief settled into his chest like sediment, heavy and unmoving. Anger flared, then faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made even getting out of bed feel like an act of discipline. He tried reaching out. Old friends. Men he'd known since high school, since the early days of marriage and mortgages, and shared jokes about responsibility. Over coffee and short phone calls, they offered the expected lines. Hang in there, marriages go through phases, don't make any rash decisions. Their concern felt distant, like advice read off a card. None of them had seen Eliza's eyes in that hallway. None of them had been reduced to just her ride. David thanked them and hung up, lonelier than before. A week later, the town council meeting gave him nowhere to hide. The room was packed, folding chairs lined up beneath fluorescent lights that flattened every expression. David took his usual seat near the front, posture straight out of habit. When the agenda reached land use and zoning, the council chair nodded toward him. "As you all know," the man said, "Mr. Bishop's property continues to be vital to the town's long-term planning." Polite applause followed. David's name passed through the room with a familiar respect, but it felt hollow now, like an echo from a life he'd already stepped out of. He stared at the table, listening without hearing, until movement at the door caught his eye. Eliza walked in with Matthew beside her. They took seats along the wall, close enough that David could see Matthew lean in and whisper something that made Eliza smile. The sight hollowed him out. This was his town, his history, and yet he felt like an outsider watching his own life being discussed without him. Matthew noticed him then. Their eyes met across the room, and Matthew's expression shifted into that same calm confidence David had come to hate. No shame, no hesitation, just possession. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped and voices rose. David stayed seated until the room thinned, then stood and crossed the floor before he could talk himself out of it. "Matthew," he said quietly. Matthew turned, already smiling. "David." Eliza stiffened beside him. "This isn't the place," she warned, but David didn't look at her. "I just want to ask you something," David said, his voice steady in a way that surprised even him. "How long?" Matthew tilted his head, considering. For a moment it seemed like he might deflect, offer something vague and polite. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted. "Long enough," Matthew said. The answer landed exactly where David expected it to. Confirmation without detail. A smirk that said everything he didn't want to know. David felt the surge of anger rise, hot and fast, his hands curling at his sides. For a split second, he imagined letting it loose, raising his voice, saying something unforgivable, shattering the calm mask Matthew wore so easily. He didn't. David inhaled slowly, then nodded once. The restraint cost him something, but it also gave him clarity. This wasn't a fight he could win by losing control. Eliza watched him closely, her expression unreadable. There was no apology there, no fear, just a careful distance as if she were already bracing for whatever came next. David turned away and walked out into the cold night air, the meeting hall door closing behind him with a final thud. Snow had begun to fall again, thin and relentless. He stood there for a moment, breath fogging, feeling the limits of his endurance closing in. He knew he would have to face Eliza again, really face her, without corridors or interruptions or polite witnesses. The thought tightened his chest with equal parts dread and resolve. What he didn't know was how much more he could take before something inside him finally broke. David didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the street lamp outside tracing the same familiar cracks he'd never bothered to notice before. Every decision he'd made over the last 20 years paraded through his mind with brutal clarity. The nights he'd stayed late at work instead of coming home. The times he'd chosen stability over conversation, silence over discomfort. He had believed he was building something solid. Now it felt like he'd been stacking weight on a foundation that was already hollow. By morning, the house felt different, not louder, quieter, as if the walls themselves had learned what was coming. Eliza moved through the kitchen without meeting his eyes, her phone lighting up again and again on the counter. She didn't bother hiding the messages anymore. When David asked simple questions, what time she'd be home, whether they needed groceries, her answers came clipped, transactional. "We've already talked about this," she said when he tried, carefully, to bring up what had happened at the meeting. "I'm not rehashing it." There was no admission, no regret, just a firm refusal to engage, as if denying the harm could erase it. Matthew's name slipped into her conversations like a given. "Matthew thinks," or Matthew said, each one widening the distance between them. David felt himself receding inside his own home like a guest overstaying his welcome. Outside those walls, the town noticed. At the grocery store, conversation stalled when David passed. A woman he'd known for years asked how Eliza was doing, her tone loaded with curiosity disguised as concern. Someone else mentioned seeing Eliza with Matthew downtown, their voices lowered but not low enough. The gossip moved faster than truth ever did, and David felt its pull isolating him, turning familiar places into spaces he no longer recognized. 2 days later, he sat in his lawyer's office, hands folded on a polished desk that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The conversation was calm, procedural, assets, property, timelines. David listened as if they were discussing someone else's life. When the lawyer asked if he was sure, David hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes," he said. The word carried both relief and a sharp edge of grief. Ending the marriage felt like admitting failure, but staying felt like erasing himself. When he returned home, Eliza was already packing. Boxes lined the hallway, their labels neat and efficient. She didn't explain. She didn't ask permission. She moved with purpose, as if this step had been planned long before he ever caught up. "I'll be staying somewhere else for a while," she said, taping a box shut without looking at him. David nodded, unsure what to say. The finality of it pressed down on him harder than any argument could have. This wasn't a threat or a test. It was an exit. That night, alone in the house, David sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were off, the silence heavy and unfamiliar. His emotional defenses, built over years of self-control and restraint, began to crack. Grief seeped in through the gaps, followed by fear. Without the marriage, without the role he'd played for so long, he didn't know who he was supposed to be. He thought of the land, the legacy, the identity that had once felt unshakable. Now even that seemed uncertain, like something he'd been leaning on without realizing it could give way. As the clock ticked past midnight, David realized this wasn't just the end of his marriage. It was the beginning of a reckoning he wasn't sure he was ready to face. David waited until the house was half empty before he said anything. Boxes lined the walls like silent witnesses, their cardboard edges biting into spaces that had once felt permanent. Eliza moved through the living room folding clothes with mechanical focus, as if emotion were something she'd already packed away. "We need to talk," David said. She didn't stop. "About what?" "About the fact that you're not just leaving," he said. "You're leaving for him." That finally slowed her. Eliza set a sweater down and exhaled through her nose, the sound tight with impatience rather than guilt. "I didn't want to do this like this," she said. "But yes, I've already made plans." The words landed with brutal clarity, not thinking about leaving, not considering options. Plans. David felt anger surge hot and fast, his jaw tightening until it ached. For a moment, he imagined letting it out, raising his voice, saying everything he'd swallowed for years. The image passed. What remained was a colder understanding. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You decided without me." Eliza turned to face him fully now, arms crossing like a shield. "I decided a long time ago," she said. "I just didn't tell you." David laughed once, sharp and humorless. "How long?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "Years, David. I've been emotionally checked out for years." The sentence hurt more than the affair. Years meant dinners, holidays, quiet nights he'd mistaken for peace. "Then why stay?" he asked. "Why let me think we were still?" "Because you never saw me," she cut in. "Not really. You saw what you needed me to be, the wife, the fixture. You were so busy being responsible, being admired, that there was no space left for me to be anything else." David felt the accusation settle heavily, not because it was entirely wrong, but because it came so late. "I was there," he said. "I showed up." "You showed up," Eliza agreed, "but you were never present." Before David could respond, the front door opened. Matthew stepped inside without hesitation, coat already off, like the house had quietly become his territory. He took in the scene with an assessing glance, then looked directly at David. "I told her this would be messy," Matthew said calmly, "but it's better to be honest." David's hands curled into fists. "You don't get to be here," he said. Matthew didn't flinch. "I do now." Eliza didn't object. That silence was its own answer. "She's better off," Matthew continued. "You built a life around expectations, yours, the town's, everyone's. She was suffocating." David met his gaze, feeling the insult settle deep. "And you're the solution." Matthew's mouth curved slightly. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." The restraint David had been clinging to trembled, but he held it. Fighting now would change nothing. It wouldn't restore respect or undo what had already been decided without him. He turned back to Eliza. "If this is what you want," he said, voice steady despite the weight in his chest, "then give me a clean break. No half conversations, no shared spaces, no pretending we're still a family." Eliza looked away. "I can't promise that," she said. "We still have obligations, appearances, people." There it was again. The town, the image, the performance. Even now she wanted control over the narrative. David nodded slowly. "Then you're choosing to keep this unfinished." Her silence confirmed it. That night, lines were drawn without paperwork. Eliza took a suitcase and left with Matthew, headlights sweeping briefly across the living room walls before disappearing down the drive. David stood alone in the doorway long after the sound of the engine faded. By morning, the divide had spread outward. Family members called, choosing sides carefully. Some offered sympathy, others offered distance. Conversations shortened. Invitations quietly vanished. The marriage wasn't just ending, it was reorganizing the entire social map around him. David sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him, realizing how thoroughly his life had split in two. And as the house settled into its new, fractured silence, one truth pressed harder than the rest. Whatever came next, he would be facing it alone, and without the luxury of denial. The house stayed quiet in the weeks that followed, the kind of quiet that pressed in rather than soothed. David moved through his days without structure, no longer a husband with a shared routine, no longer certain what his role was meant to be. Every mirror felt accusatory. Without Eliza beside him, without the familiar shape of marriage to anchor him, he struggled to recognize the man staring back. Even the title he'd worn for years, landowner, provider, pillar, felt like a coat that no longer fit. He tried to impose order where he could. Early mornings, long lists, controlled movements. It was how he'd always handled uncertainty, narrowed the world until it felt manageable again. But emotion didn't obey structure. Grief came in waves, anger followed close behind, and between them stretched an empty space where confidence used to live. At a charity dinner he'd committed to months earlier, David sat at a round table beneath soft lights and white tablecloths, listening to conversations slide past him. People greeted him warmly enough, but something had shifted. The admiration he once felt was tempered now with curiosity, with quiet assessment. He caught fragments of lowered voices and stopped smiles. For the first time, he understood how conditional belonging could be. He excused himself early, the applause from the podium sounding distant as he stepped out into the cold night. He drove aimlessly for a while, then turned down the familiar gravel road that led onto his land. The gate stood open as it always had, the fence line stretching into darkness. David parked and walked, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground. This land had been his inheritance and his responsibility, acres he'd protected and expanded, believing it said something essential about who he was. Under the bare winter trees, that certainty felt thin. He stopped at a rise overlooking the fields and tried to imagine letting go of the weight of legacy, of expectation. The thought unsettled him. If the land didn't define him, what did? The answer didn't come easily. His phone buzzed with a message from his daughter, short, careful. She was staying with Eliza for now. She needed space. David read it twice, the words sinking slowly. He understood her loyalty even as it cut him. Still, the distance hurt in a way nothing else had. Losing a marriage was one thing. Losing the easy closeness with his child felt like another kind of erasure. A few days later, David sat across from Pastor Daniel in the pastor's office, the same place he'd sought counsel before weddings and funerals. The pastor spoke gently about forgiveness, about finding purpose beyond pain, about trusting that identity wasn't lost but transformed. David listened, nodded, even thanked him. But the words floated above the reality of his loss, too abstract to hold on to. When he left, the clarity came unannounced. He couldn't rebuild what he'd lost by clinging to titles or approval. Whatever came next would have to be constructed from something more honest than status. Standing in the parking lot, keys in hand, David felt the unsettling freedom of that realization. Starting over meant shedding the version of himself everyone expected, and he wasn't yet sure what would remain once he did. The shift didn't happen all at once. It came in small, deliberate choices that David made when no one was watching. He stopped introducing himself by what he owned. When conversations drifted toward acreage and value, he redirected them, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with quiet resolve. For the first time in years, he paid attention to how it felt to speak without defending a title. It was uncomfortable. It was also freeing. Eliza moved out on a gray morning that matched the mood of the house. Her things were already packed, the room stripped of personal touches that had once softened the space. David watched from the doorway as she loaded the last box into her car. There were no final words, no dramatic goodbye, just the dull thud of a trunk closing and the sound of gravel under tires. When she was gone, the house felt cavernous, every empty room echoing with what used to be there. David walked through it slowly, touching door frames, lingering in places where laughter had once lived, letting himself feel the loss without trying to outrun it. Instead of retreating, he went outside. He drove the length of his land, stopping where he rarely had before. He spoke directly with workers rather than through managers. He made decisions based on what felt right rather than what would look good at a town meeting. There was satisfaction in the work itself, mud on his boots, wind on his face, the honest fatigue that came from doing something tangible. For the first time, the land felt less like a symbol and more like a choice. The meeting with his lawyer came and went with quiet efficiency. Papers were signed, dates were set. When it was done, David sat alone in his car for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel. Relief washed over him, followed closely by grief. Ending the marriage closed a chapter he'd spent half his life writing. Even knowing it was necessary didn't make it painless. He began to spend evenings alone by design, not avoidance. Cooking simple meals, sitting in silence, letting memories surface without judgment. He reflected on the ways he'd measured success, security, approval, consistency, and how those measures had failed him when he needed them most. The emotional toll of the past months was undeniable, but it no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like information. Gradually, people reached out. Not about land deals or donations, but about coffee, about walks, about shared history. A neighbor asked how he was doing and waited for a real answer. An old friend invited him fishing, no expectations attached. David found himself saying yes, discovering. That connection didn't have to come with obligation. At a local fundraiser, someone introduced him without mentioning his property. "This is David," they said simply. The absence of a title surprised him more than it should have. He smiled, genuinely, and realized he didn't miss it. The community's perception shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. David wasn't the distant figure anymore. He listened more, spoke less. When he did speak, it was with intention. People responded to that honesty in ways he hadn't anticipated. They saw him, not the land, not the legacy. Standing alone on his porch one evening, watching the sun sink behind the fields, David felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Contentment without validation. His sense of worth no longer hinged on marriage or wealth. It came from alignment between who he was and how he lived. The realization didn't answer every question. The future remained uncertain, and relationships still needed mending. But as night fell and the land lay quiet beneath the stars, David understood that the power he'd lost was never taken from him. It had simply been misplaced, and now, finally, he was taking it back. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter all morning before David worked up the nerve to open it. He recognized his daughter's handwriting immediately, careful, rounded, familiar in a way that tightened his chest. He carried it to the table and sat, breathing once before sliding a finger under the flap. She didn't take sides in the letter. She didn't accuse or explain. She wrote about missing him, about how confusing everything felt, about how she still loved him, even if she didn't know how to fix what had broken. She thanked him for always showing up to her school events, for teaching her how to drive on the back roads, for listening when she needed quiet instead of answers. Near the end, she wrote, "I hope one day we can talk without everything else in the room." David set the letter down and covered his face with his hands. The emotion came fast and unguarded, grief, relief, gratitude tangled together. For the first time in weeks, something inside him loosened. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't erased. He was still a father, still seen. That clarity didn't erase the loss, but it reframed it. Sitting there, the truth finally settled without resistance. The marriage was over, not paused, not repairable, over. And accepting that didn't feel like surrender. It felt like stepping out of a storm. Painful, yes, but survivable. He tried once more to reach Eliza. A short message. Neutral, honest, I'd like to talk for closure. The reply came hours later, brief and final. She wasn't ready. She needed to focus on her new life. With Matthew. The rejection stung, but it didn't knock him off balance the way it once would have. What unsettled him more was how Matthew seemed to insert himself everywhere. Messages relayed through mutual contacts. Comments made in passing at community gatherings. Matthew's presence lingered like a shadow, a reminder that even separation hadn't granted David full distance. Isolation crept back in, quieter this time. David threw himself into work not to escape but to anchor himself. The land responded differently now. Tasks that once felt automatic required intention. The fields looked the same, yet he sensed the shift in himself. Ownership no longer meant control. It meant responsibility without illusion. One afternoon, he found Pastor Daniel standing near the fence line, hands tucked into his coat against the wind. They walked together for a while, boots crunching over frozen ground. The pastor spoke gently, not about reconciliation, but about forgiveness. "Not for her," he said. "For you. Forgiveness is how you stop carrying what no longer belongs to you." David listened in silence. Forgiveness felt premature, almost insulting, but the idea lingered. Letting go didn't mean excusing. It meant choosing not to be defined by what had been taken. As the sun dipped low, David felt the weight of expectation ease slightly. Healing, he realized, wasn't a moment. It was a process that demanded patience he wasn't used to giving himself. There would be setbacks, days when anger resurfaced, nights when the quiet cut too deep. But standing there, the land stretching out before him, letter folded carefully in his pocket, David understood something essential. Growth didn't erase pain, it transformed it. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, he believed that transformation was possible, even if the hardest parts were still ahead. Eliza called on a Tuesday afternoon, her name lighting up David's phone like an old reflex. For a moment, he considered letting it ring out. Instead, he answered, his voice measured. "We need to talk," she said, "in person." They met at a small cafe on the edge of town, neutral ground neither of them had reason to claim. The place was quiet, late afternoon light slanting through the windows, dust motes hanging in the air. Eliza W. as already there when David arrived, sitting stiffly with both hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Matthew's truck was parked across the street. David noticed it immediately. They sat in silence for a beat, the weight of everything unsaid pressing between them. Finally, Eliza spoke. "I didn't call to fight," she said. "I just need you to understand." David nodded once, "Then talk." She looked at him carefully as if gauging how much honesty he could withstand. "I never felt truly loved by you," she said. "Not the way I needed. You provided, you protected, but you were always somewhere else, even when you were right next to me." The words hurt, but they weren't a surprise anymore. David felt them land without the same sharpness as before. "I thought I was doing what mattered," he said. "I thought love looked like showing up, like keeping everything steady." "It wasn't enough," Eliza said softly, "for me." He absorbed that, the truth of it settling alongside the betrayal. "So you found it with him." She nodded. "Matthew saw me, he listened. He didn't treat me like part of the structure." David glanced out the window where Matthew sat in his truck, visible through the glass. He hadn't come inside, but his presence was unmistakable, like a shadow hovering just beyond the conversation. "He doesn't trust me to talk to you alone," David said. Eliza flinched but didn't deny it. "He's just being careful." "That's not care," David replied quietly. "That's control." Eliza looked away. "You don't know him the way I do." "Maybe not," David said, "but I know what it feels like to be replaced." The silence stretched. When Eliza finally spoke again, her voice had changed. "There's something else," she said. David felt it before she said the words, a tightening in his chest, a sense of imbalance. "What?" She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." The cafe seemed to tilt. Sound drained from the room, replaced by a high, hollow ringing. David stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence to soften the blow. "Matthew S.," she added. The word struck with brutal finality. David felt something inside him fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Every remaining thread tying him to the past snapped at once. "I see," he said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. Eliza watched him closely, perhaps expecting anger, collapse, something explosive. What she got was stillness. "That's why I needed to meet," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me." David nodded slowly. The betrayal was total now, layered beyond repair. And yet beneath the devastation, something else stirred, a clarity he hadn't felt before. "This changes nothing," he said. "It just confirms what I already knew." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean?" "That this is over," David said, "completely." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Matthew shifted in his truck outside, as if sensing the shift inside the cafe. "I'm done," David continued. "No more conversations, no more updates, no more shared space. Whatever we were, it ends here." Eliza's eyes filled, but she didn't argue. "I never wanted to hurt you like this." "I know," David said, "but intention doesn't undo impact." He stood, pushing his chair in with careful precision. "I wish you well," he added, meaning it in the only way he could, without attachment. As he walked out, he didn't look at Matthew. He didn't need to. The past was finally, undeniably behind him. Outside, the air felt colder, sharper, real. David stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the truth settle. His world had shattered again, but this time it hadn't broken him. It had freed him. And as he drove away, David knew the next chapter of his life would begin only after he left everything, and everyone, who belonged to the old one behind. David returned to the house alone just before dusk. The sky stretched thin and gray above the roofline. The place felt different without Eliza's presence, not empty exactly, but paused, like it was holding its breath. He didn't turn on the lights right away. Instead, he moved through the room slowly, opening drawers and cabinets he hadn't touched in years, letting memory guide his hands. In the hallway closet, he found an old photo album wedged behind winter coats. He carried it to the dining table and sat, flipping through pages that smelled faintly of dust and time. There they were, him and Eliza at the start. Younger, closer, arms wrapped around each other at county fairs and backyard barbecues, faces relaxed in a way that felt foreign now. He lingered on one photo in particular. The two of them standing on the edge of the land shortly after they were married, the fields behind them wide and full of promise. They'd believed back then that effort alone could sustain love. David closed the album and leaned back in his chair, the weight of it pressing into his chest. The love had been real. That was the part he needed to acknowledge, not imagined, not one-sided. It had simply eroded, slow. Quietly, until what remained was obligation wearing the shape of commitment. Knowing that didn't excuse the betrayal, but it did soften the edges of his anger. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, drawn toward the land the way he always was when he needed perspective. The cold air cleared his head as he walked, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. This land had outlasted every version of him. It had seen him hopeful, distracted, proud, broken. Standing there now, he understood it differently. It wasn't proof of who he was, it was a witness to who he'd been becoming. As he walked, David let himself think honestly about his failures. He'd confused stability with intimacy. He'd assumed providing was enough. He'd hidden behind responsibility when vulnerability felt inconvenient. Those truths stung, but they didn't destroy him. They informed him. At the same time, he didn't minimize Eliza's choices. She had lied. She had replaced conversation with secrecy, partnership with escape. Both things could be true at once, and accepting that felt like real progress. By the time he returned to the house, lights glowed in neighboring windows. A few people waved as he passed. Others stopped to talk, brief, sincere exchanges that surprised him. The community was changing its posture toward him. He wasn't the distant landowner anymore. He was the man who'd been publicly wounded and hadn't collapsed. There was a quiet respect in that recognition, one that had nothing to do with acreage or wealth. Inside, David poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching night settle over the fields. The pain was still there, a dull ache he suspected would linger for a while. But it no longer controlled him. He felt something close to closure, not because everything was resolved, but because he had stopped fighting reality. He understood now that love required presence, not just provision. That self-worth couldn't be outsourced to roles or approval. That forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to let bitterness dictate the future. David finished his drink and set the glass down, breathing evenly. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new challenges. The work of rebuilding wasn't finished yet. But for the first time since the night everything unraveled, David felt steady enough to face what came next, and strong enough to walk forward without looking back. David's first counseling session felt more intimidating than any town meeting he'd ever attended. The office was quiet, deliberately neutral, the kind of space designed to invite honesty without pressure. He sat across from a woman who didn't know his land, his name, or his history, and for once that felt like an advantage. When she asked him why he was there, David hesitated, then spoke plainly. He talked about the marriage, the betrayal, the way he'd built his life around being needed instead of being known. Saying it out loud stripped the story of its mythology. It hurt, but it also clarified. He kept going back. Week by week, the sessions forced him to confront patterns he'd long ignored. How he avoided conflict by retreating into work. How he measured worth through endurance. How he'd mistaken emotional restraint for strength. The process wasn't dramatic. It was incremental, uncomfortable, and real. Healing, he learned, didn't arrive as a breakthrough. It accumulated quietly. Outside those sessions, David began to claim time for himself without apology. He returned to small interests he'd abandoned years ago. Early morning walks, restoring an old workbench in the shed, reading without distraction. Activities that once seemed trivial now grounded him, offering moments of calm that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. In the stillness, he found room to breathe. His relationship with his daughter shifted, cautiously at first. They met for coffee, conversations careful but sincere. He listened more than he spoke. When she talked about her confusion, her loyalty to her mother, he didn't argue or defend himself. He let her speak. Over time, the distance softened. Laughter returned in small doses. Trust followed, fragile but growing. Being her father, he realized, wasn't about authority, it was about presence. The land took on a different meaning too. David spent time walking its boundaries, not with an investor's eye but with memory. He remembered working alongside his own father, learning patience from soil and seasons. The land wasn't an asset anymore. It was a lineage, a place where effort and time intersected. Tending to it became personal, almost meditative. News of Eliza filtered in through mutual acquaintances, as it inevitably did. She and Matthew were settling into their new life, preparing for the changes ahead. David felt the old resentment stir once, then recede. Counseling had taught him to notice those feelings without feeding them. Letting go wasn't an act of generosity toward her, it was an act of self-preservation. As weeks turned into months, David felt something solid take root inside him. Resilience, earned rather than assumed. He was no longer carrying the weight of what had been lost. He was learning to live without it. Moving on, he understood now, wasn't about replacing a marriage or recreating a life that no longer fit. It was about honoring what remained, his values, his relationships, his capacity for growth. Standing on his porch one evening, watching the fields settle into twilight, David felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. It wasn't the absence of pain, but the presence of acceptance. The road ahead was still unwritten. Challenges would come. But for the first time, David wasn't walking away from his past. He was walking forward with it, lighter, wiser, and ready for whatever the next turn might reveal. The change wasn't announced. It unfolded quietly in the way people looked at David and the way conversations lingered a little longer when he spoke. The town had always known him as the landowner, the steady presence behind donations and decisions. Now they were beginning to see him as a man who had been tested and had chosen not to disappear. The invitation came from the community center, a request for him to speak at a local gathering about stewardship and resilience. David hesitated before accepting. Standing in front of a room used to feel like performance, another obligation tied to reputation. This felt different. When he finally stepped up to the podium, he didn't talk about acreage or legacy. He spoke about failure, about how losing what defined you can force you to find what matters. The room was quiet, attentive in a way he hadn't experienced before. For the first time in years, David felt like he was offering something real. Afterward, people approached him not with praise but with stories of their own. Loss, change, rebuilding. David listened, recognizing pieces of himself in each one. His sense of purpose shifted from maintaining an image to fostering connection. He became involved in local causes not because they expected him to, but because he wanted to. Mentorship programs, environmental efforts tied to the land, projects that aligned with his values rather than his name. Each step reinforced the same truth. Belonging didn't require perfection, only presence. Then Eliza reached out. The message was careful, neutral. She suggested starting fresh as co-parents, keeping things amicable for the sake of their daughter. David read it slowly, weighing the intention against the cost. He understood the practicality of her request. He also understood himself. He replied politely, kindly. He supported cooperation, communication where necessary, but not reconciliation, not emotional closeness disguised as civility. Protecting the space he'd fought to create mattered more than appearances. Matthew appeared again at a community event weeks later. Their interaction was brief, restrained, polite nods, neutral words. There was no animosity but no warmth either. The boundary between them was clear, and both men respected it without needing to say so. As the months passed, David felt his new identity solidify. He wasn't defined by his marriage or his wealth. He was defined by his choices, his resilience, his capacity for growth. Peace didn't arrive as a grand moment. It settled gradually, like a landscape after a storm. One evening, as David locked up the community center after a volunteer meeting, he paused, keys in hand. The quiet satisfaction he felt wasn't something he could have imagined a year earlier. For the first time in a long while, David wasn't just surviving. He was living, grounded in who he had become, and ready for whatever the future might ask of him. The call came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind David had learned to appreciate. No meetings, no obligations, just work that filled the hours without demanding anything from him. The number was unfamiliar, local. He almost let it go to voicemail. "I'll be brief," the man said after introducing himself. "A local businessman, quietly influential. I'm interested in purchasing your land, all of it." David stood still, phone pressed to his ear, the words settling slowly. Offers had come before, developers, investors, out-of-town money, but this one was different. The terms were thoughtful, respectful, serious, the kind of offer that didn't circle back. After the call ended, David sat down heavily on the edge of the porch. He looked out across the fields, the late sun stretching shadows across ground he'd known his entire life. The land had never just been property. It was memory, proof, an extension of himself. Letting it go felt unthinkable. For days he avoided the decision. He walked the perimeter, ran his hands along fence posts his father had set. He remembered being a boy, riding beside him in a truck that smelled like oil and dust, learning without being taught. The land had been constancy when everything else shifted. Selling it felt like betrayal of legacy, of identity, of the man he used to be. But the longer David sat with the idea, the more another truth surfaced. His attachment wasn't just love, it was fear. The land had become the last place he could hide from change, the final anchor tying him to a version of himself shaped by obligation and endurance. He told himself it defined him. In reality, it had begun to confine him. One evening he stood at the edge of the field as the wind moved through dry grass. For the first time, he imagined a future where the land wasn't his and felt something unexpected. Not panic, relief. The realization unsettled him enough to call his lawyer. The process moved quickly once he committed. Papers, surveys, meetings that felt procedural rather than emotional. With every signature, the weight he'd carried for years lifted incrementally. By the time the sale was finalized, David felt something close to lightness. He walked the land one last time before handing it over. No ceremony, no witnesses, just quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said aloud, unsure who he was speaking to, the ground, the past, or himself. News spread fast. Shock rippled through the town. Questions followed. Why would he sell? Was something wrong? Had he lost his way? David answered simply when asked. It was time. Standing in the empty house that evening, documents filed away, David felt the finality settle in. He was no longer the landowner, no longer tethered to a role he'd outgrown. The identity he'd clung to was gone, and he was still standing. Outside, the night air felt sharper, clearer. The future stretched open in front of him, undefined and honest. David took a slow breath, knowing this step, this final release, had changed everything. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The rebuilding didn't announce itself as a milestone. It began quietly in the rhythm of shared time. David's daughter came over on a Saturday morning, uncertain at first, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure where she fit anymore. David made coffee, asked about school, listened without interrupting. They sat at the kitchen table long after the cups were empty, talking about ordinary things. There was no need to explain the past. For now, it was enough to be present. They started meeting regularly, walks through town, drives on back roads where David had once taught her how to handle the wheel. He watched her relax again, her laughter returning without effort. The shadow of the marriage faded from their conversations, replaced by something sturdier, a relationship built on honesty rather than obligation. Being her father no longer felt like a role he had to defend. It felt earned. David's days filled with new purpose. Without the land to manage, he redirected his energy into the community. He volunteered with local groups that supported families navigating loss and transition, offering time instead of money. His presence carried weight not because of status, but because of experience. People trusted him. He knew what it meant to lose everything you thought defined you. Old friends resurfaced, conversations picking up where they'd left off, unburdened by expectation. David met new people as well, neighbors, volunteers, parents. Connections formed around shared effort rather than shared history. The ease surprised him. Without the armor of his former identity, he found himself more open, more approachable. Eliza reached out again, her message measured. She spoke of logistics, of maintaining peace, of the future. David responded clearly. He was willing to communicate where necessary, but his boundaries were firm. There would be no emotional entanglement, no revisiting what had been resolved. Protecting the life he was building mattered more than revisiting what had been lost. Standing on his porch one evening, David felt the weight of the past settle into something manageable. It would always be part of him, but it no longer dictated his choices. The support he needed came from genuine connections, from his daughter's trust, from friends who showed up without expectation, from a community that saw him as more than what he once owned. He understood now that rebuilding wasn't about restoring what had been broken. It was about creating something honest in its place. As the lights came on across the neighborhood, David felt grounded in a future that was his to shape, free from the past's control, and finally, truly his own. Peace arrived quietly without ceremony. David noticed it one morning as he stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the street wake up. There was no tightness in his chest, no inventory of regrets running in the background, just stillness. For the first time in years, his life felt like something he was shaping, not managing. He began making plans, not the kind tied to obligation or expectation, but plans that belonged to him alone. A road trip he'd postponed for decades. A visit to distant relatives he'd drifted from, not out of conflict but neglect. He marked dates on a calendar with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, each one a reminder that the future was open again. The weight he'd carried for so long, the mistakes, the betrayal, the slow erosion of trust, no longer pressed down on him. Those memories hadn't vanished, but they'd lost their authority. They informed him rather than defined him. David could think about the past now without feeling pulled back into it. His daughter flourished in ways that made him quietly proud. She moved forward with confidence, her laughter easier, her presence unguarded. They shared meals, stories, plans. The bond between them felt earned, strengthened by honesty and patience. David no longer worried about proving himself to her. He showed up, and that was enough. With time opening up, David explored interests he'd once dismissed as impractical. Writing, restoration projects, long walks without a destination. Each pursuit revealed parts of himself he'd left unexplored, not because they lacked value, but because he hadn't believed he deserved them. The act of choosing them now felt like reclaiming ground he'd unknowingly surrendered. One evening he sat down and reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The pain had been real, the losses undeniable, but so was the growth. He'd learned that love couldn't survive without presence. That strength wasn't measured by endurance alone. That letting go was sometimes the bravest act of all. As the year turned, David stood at the threshold of something new. Not a replacement life, not a repaired version of the old one. A different path entirely, built on clarity, connection, and choice. He stepped forward with confidence, unburdened by the past, ready to build a life that reflected who he had become, and who he was still discovering himself to be. The event filled the town hall in a way David hadn't seen in years. Folding chairs stretched wall to wall, lights warm and steady, conversations layered with anticipation rather than obligation. When he arrived, a few heads turned, then more. Not with curiosity this time, but recognition. Someone announced him quietly, and the title that followed wasn't landowner. It was guest of honor. David felt the weight of that as he took his seat near the front. This wasn't about property or donations. It was about the work he'd done since everything fell apart, the visible effort of rebuilding without spectacle. He sat straighter, not out of pride but out of gratitude. When his name was called, the applause surprised him. It wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. David stepped to the podium and rested his hands on the worn wood, letting the room settle before he spoke. "I used to believe," he began, "that resilience meant holding everything together at any cost." A few nods rippled through the crowd. "What I've learned is that resilience sometimes means letting things fall apart so you can see what's actually worth rebuilding." He spoke plainly without rehearsed lines, about losing what defined him, about the danger of confusing endurance with strength, about self-worth that doesn't rely on approval, titles, or silence. He talked about emotional freedom not as happiness but as honesty, the courage to live without pretending. The room stayed quiet, attentive in a way that felt earned. Afterward, people approached him slowly, respectfully. Old acquaintances spoke with warmth instead of deference. New connections formed easily, conversations grounded in shared experience rather than status. David listened, responded, laughed. He felt present in a way he never had before. Across the room, he noticed Eliza arrive with Matthew. She stayed near the back, her posture composed, her attention divided. David registered her presence without the old jolt of tension. It was simply information now. Later, near the refreshment table, their paths crossed. Eliza hesitated, then spoke. "You did well," she said. "Thank you," David replied, his tone even. He asked about their daughter, listened politely, offered kindness without invitation or expectation. There was no need for resolution. The conversation ended naturally, and they went their separate ways. As the evening wound down, David stepped outside into the cool air, the murmur of voices fading behind him. He stood there for a moment, reflecting. Legacy, he realized, wasn't something you left behind in deeds or assets. It was something you built quietly, in relationships, in integrity, in the way you chose to live after loss. The land was gone. The marriage ended. And yet, standing there, David felt more whole than he ever had. His legacy wasn't tied to what he owned or who he used to be. It lived in the connections he'd nurtured, the honesty he'd embraced, and the freedom he'd claimed. As he headed home, the night open and calm, David understood that this wasn't an ending. It was a marker, a moment that confirmed he was finally living a life that would matter long after titles faded. David returned to the edge of town just before dusk, the sky washed in pale winter light. He parked the car and sat for a moment with the engine off, hands resting loosely in his lap. When he thought back on the man he'd been, measured, contained, defined by what he owned, he didn't feel shame. He felt distance. That man had done the best he could with what he understood at the time. This version of himself carried more truth, even if it had been earned the hard way. He stepped out and walked the familiar path toward the land that had once been his. Ownership had changed, but memory hadn't. The fence line still followed the same curve. The wind still moved through the grass with the same low sound. David stopped where the ground dipped slightly, a place he'd stood countless times before, and let himself be still. He didn't mourn it. He thanked it for the ons, for the years, for teaching him endurance even when he'd misunderstood its purpose. "Goodbye," he said quietly, not as a loss but as a release. Later that evening, his daughter joined him at home. They cooked dinner together, laughing when they burned the edges, talking about plans instead of problems. When they sat at the table, the ease between them felt natural, unforced. David listened as she talked about her goals, her hopes, her uncertainty. He saw strength there and resilience, and felt proud not because she was thriving, but because she trusted him enough to share the process. They sat together after, the house warm and calm, the future open. David realized that this, connection without condition, was what he'd been chasing without knowing how to name it. When she left, he opened a notebook and began sketching ideas, travel routes, places he'd never seen, projects he'd postponed for someday. There were no deadlines, no expectations attached, just curiosity. For the first time, the unknown didn't feel like risk. It felt like permission. Standing by the window, David looked out at the quiet street and imagined the road ahead. It wouldn't be perfect. There would still be moments of doubt, flashes of memory, but none of them held power over him anymore. He wasn't reacting to life now, he was choosing it. As the night settled in, David felt grounded in a truth that had taken a lifetime to earn. Freedom wasn't the absence of loss. It was the presence of agency. And that was something no one could take from him again. David walks into the future, a free man with the wisdom and strength to live life on his own terms.